world where information, true and false, is coming at us from all directions, how can teachers and students learn what to believe?
As journalists like to say, facts are stubborn things. But I also think that we think about mis and disinformation and fact checking in the wrong way. I see this a lot on social media where if someone debunks a viral rumor, it resonates with your positions, your values, that your response is to sort of push back against the fact check and defend the misinformation as though debunking it somehow hurts your political position. I argue the opposite. I think mis and disinformation aims to exploit us.
Peter Adams is the Senior Vice President for Research and Design at the News Literacy Project. I'm Sheila Solomon with Rivet 360, and this is Chicago Media Talks, a show in which people in Chicago media talk about Chicago media. We're recording this via Zoom and broadcasting it live on YouTube. Peter, what's the News Literacy Project got to do with fake news, misinformation, and disinformation?
For those folks who aren't familiar with the News Literacy Project, we're a national education nonprofit organization that provides training and resources to help students and the public. Now, that's one change in our mission that we made in recent years, evaluate the credibility of the information they encounter in their daily lives. And we're really building a movement to create a stronger democracy by helping people be better informed, more engaged, and more empowered individuals. So an answer to your question has a lot to do with fake news and mis and disinformation. We want people to recognize the impact that false information has, to have a good, strong idea of what credible information involves, the role it plays in their lives, the role the press plays in democracy, and working again with educators to reach students all over the country to do that work.
How have media contributed to any of these issues?
That's a good question. Certainly, news media haven't always handled mis and disinformation or false narratives responsibly or well. It's not easy work. There are lots of shades of gray, right, between something that's entirely false and something that is verified and fact-based. So in between those poles, you have lots of conversations you can have about productive, responsible framing, providing the public with enough context, making sure that everyone's information needs are represented and met, and of course, not doing any harm or distorting any issues in coverage by news media as well. So, when it comes to those kinds of conversations, we have lessons and resources that help students understand, what the aspirational standards of quality journalism are, what some of the debates in journalism are today without getting too inside baseball, but we try to help make those accessible for teachers and students to discuss in the classroom and to understand the ways in which the practice of journalism is changing and the news business is changing as well.
Tell us a little more about that. For example, what are some of those lessons or programs that the News Literacy Project, which we also sometimes call NLP, put in place to help combat what's become a lack of trust of the news media?
Yeah, so I think there are two sides of that, right? I think on the one hand, we want to make sure that students and the public have an accurate understanding of the way newsrooms operate. So some of the things that people cite in public opinion surveys by Knight and Gallup and the Pew Research Center and others about why they distrust news media actually aren't accurate reflections of the way newsrooms actually operate. So there's a disconnect, right, between the way journalism actually happens and the way the public thinks it happens that drives some of that trust conversation. And then there are legitimate things that have damaged trust over time that also have to be dealt with. So we work kind of on both of those fronts, trying to help students understand, get an accurate understanding of the way newsrooms work, and also to understand, what the process of verification involves, what fairness really looks like in news coverage, and to reflect on that and think through that for themselves, to understand, what quality sourcing looks like in a news report, what some of the considerations around inclusive sourcing would be, and then to recognize that. So we have some lessons on our Checkology virtual classroom. So we have a free online learning portal that lives at checkology.org that teachers all over the country can use at no cost. And we have a few lessons that help draw those things into focus. One called Practicing Quality Journalism, that puts students in a scenario, and they're put in the shoes of a rookie reporter, and they have to make some really key decisions as they gather information and report it to the public and verify it. They have to choose between early tweets to release. They have to choose between headlines and lead paragraphs and lead photos. And some of those options include loaded language, for example, that wouldn't be fair, or they include an error of fact. So they have to sort through that and get a sense of just how challenging the practice of journalism can be. We also have a lesson about news media bias, sort of helping students think through, first of all, what bias is and some of the different types of bias that can affect coverage, whether that's a demographic bias or a bias toward trying to be neutral or false balance, or a bias toward big stories. And then some of the forms that bias can take, whether it's loaded language or story selection, and so on. So it presents them with a kind of framework for thinking about news media bias. So those are just a couple of the pieces on Checkology. We also have professional development trainings and webinars for the public about some of these same issues as well. And then some infographics and quicker stuff on our website that folks can check out at newslit.org.
How do the changing business models for media companies play into all of this?
That's a challenge. We're trying to help students understand first the role that the press has played historically in democracy, the watchdog role that it has played as kind of the fourth estate, and then to get a clear picture of what's happening to the news business and the news ecosystem, including the shrinking number of especially local news organizations, and the impact that it can have on communities when they lose a local paper or they lose local news coverage, and the effect just on communities' lives, individual family members' lives, but also the greater impact on democracy. And we try to do that again in a way that some of this stuff is a little bit abstract and difficult for students, especially younger students, to understand. So we try to make that a little more immediate. We have a great classroom guide to accompany a documentary film called Storm Lake that you can access on our website. We are doing another push for that this fall for educators all across the country, again at no cost. We've purchased licenses for the film and have a 60-minute cut of the film hosted on a special site for educators. That's a great way to get into that issue, I think, because it can be kind of abstract, but if you help students sort of work through some of the scenes of that film and then use our classroom guide in tandem with that, you can kind of help surface some of those issues.
Why and when did NLP get started in Chicago?
In Chicago in 2009, NLP was founded in 2008 by a former Los Angeles Times investigative reporter named Alan C. Miller, who actually visited his daughter's middle school classroom to talk about what he did as a journalist and why it mattered, and figured out that the students there didn't really understand what distinguished standards-based journalism from tweets and posts from people online that they didn't know, right? From user-generated content, things they came across on YouTube. And that alarmed him. And so Alan started sketching out an idea for an organization that could bring journalists to classrooms across the country and have them talk about what they did, but also bring the larger lessons that he tried to sort of convey to that group of students, and left that middle school classroom feeling like he had really had an impact, but also was alarmed at the same time at the lack of understanding of what standards-based news sources do and the function they play in our lives and in democracy. So that was the impetus for him founding NLP. And then shortly after NLP was founded, we got a seed grant from the McCormick Foundation here in Chicago that launched our Chicago program in those days.
I was part of the interview team who chose Peter in 2009 for his first role at the News Literacy Project. Why did the offices get started here in Chicago? What was it about Chicago that perhaps made that happen?
Yeah, so there was, again, the McCormick Foundation here in Chicago was deeply invested not just in supporting journalism and journalism education, but also in civics and civic education. And they were funding that work primarily in Chicago, but also across the country. And so they immediately saw the impact there, right, for both of their two of their major funding initiatives. And so I think that seed money had Alan sort of stretched to Chicago, maybe before he was entirely there, but he saw the rationale. And we also had a very willing partner in Chicago Public Schools. So in those days, in the first, I don't know, 6 or 7 years of NLP's life, we had on the ground, in class, in-person programming with staff members in 3 of our cities. So we launched right away in Washington, D.C., where Alan is based, in New York City, and then very quickly in Chicago with the McCormick funding. And the model in those days was to do a drop-in unit in schools, middle schools and high schools across those cities, where an NLP staffer would partner with a teacher and design a drop-in unit. Sometimes that was a 2 or 3 week contiguous unit, and sometimes it was News Literacy Fridays throughout a semester. And we would teach or co-teach lesson plans with that teacher, and then schedule journalist volunteers in that market to come into the classroom physically and work with the students and teach a news literacy lesson. So not really career day, but have a learning objective and actually talk to students about their work and give students a task. And the learning outcomes were very strong, and the feedback from school partners was very strong in that program. But ultimately we couldn't scale it. So that's where we moved online with Checkology. But Chicago has always been kind of NLP's laboratory and our showcase. That's what Alan likes to call it, because we tried out a lot of new things here. We just had the right mix of funders, a very active group of local news organizations who were very supportive of our mission, individual journalist volunteers who were very generous with their time, a very supportive school district, and really strong school partners. And that all just sort of crystallized here in Chicago for NLP.
So how have things evolved here in Chicago, or how are they evolving?
We piloted our digital unit here in Chicago before Checkology was built. And we used that pilot and the learning metrics from that pilot to raise money to build Checkology. So without that, we would be in a very different place today. We also created a new kind of teacher professional development here in Chicago that we call News Lit Camps, which involve a news organization and a school district coming together to do a day-long professional development event. We did our very first one here in Chicago. It was sort of the brainchild of who was then the head of social studies at Chicago Public Schools, Heather Van Benthuizen. She's still with the district in another role. And she and I were chatting, and she had been a classroom teacher that I worked with years ago. And just sort of struck on this idea: what if we had teachers, come into a newsroom for a day of sessions and conversations with educators and journalists? And we did the first one at the Chicago Sun-Times back in 2018, I think. And now our News Lit Camp program is a big initiative of ours. We do 10 to 12 a year in newsrooms all across the country. We have worked to provide educators who use Checkology with the same opportunity to explore a directory of journalist volunteers in Checkology. So if you're a registered educator and a Checkology user, you can browse a directory of journalist volunteers that now lives in Checkology. So you can actually filter by areas of expertise. You can filter by location. If you're looking for someone to physically come in your classroom, Checkology can help you set that up. If we have a volunteer within a radius of your school, we can send that request, and then the system sends a request to those journalist volunteers. So if any educators are listening and they're interested in something like that, say check out checkology.org and register for an account. And if journalists are listening and they're interested in something like that, you should reach out to the NLP team or reach out to me, and I can direct you to get added to that directory, because it's still, very important work. I mean, we've seen over the years a certain kind of magic happen when journalists and educators connect, right? I mean, they both, first of all, have really difficult jobs that way too many people think are easy, right? Journalists and teachers both tend to be underpaid for what they do. They both play a vital civic function in democracy. And lately, they've become, real political targets, but historically have become political targets sort of cyclically. I think we're in a moment now where both journalists and educators are the focus of a lot of partisan rancor, and they're being dragged into debates that unfairly, and their work is being characterized unfairly. So I think when you get educators and journalists together, a certain kind of magic happens. And when students meet actual people who produce the news, it sort of disrupts their notion of the media, right? And they actually get to see that, journalists are parents, and they go to the grocery store and they live their lives, and they're doing their best to get things right and to be fair. And of course, news coverage is imperfect, but it really helps them get a clearer picture and a more immediate sense of the role that journalists play, and gives them a different appreciation, I think, for news.
How did NLP tackle COVID and vaccine hesitancy?
Yeah, so this last 2-3 years has just been one thing after the other, as everyone knows. And COVID and vaccines have been a big part of that. It wasn't just vaccine hesitancy that COVID brought. COVID brought tons of conspiracy theories. I don't know if you remember the whole Film Your Hospital movement, where people claimed that this was all being staged somehow or exaggerated to control the population, tapping into, really long-standing and even harmful conspiratorial themes, some of which connect to anti-Semitic and extremist tropes and narratives that date back, decades, if not centuries. And people don't necessarily recognize those things when they encounter a fragment of something like that. But also, disinformation about the vaccines was big, and even continues now, about the boosters, the Queen's death. Every time a public figure passes, you see viral rumors asserting that they had just gotten a booster or something like that, which these baseless sort of ideas that just because we have a booster and people continue to pass away of various causes, that somehow there's a causal link there when there isn't. So it's a really vital topic. My team thinks about how to choose between the viral rumors that we take on as a team and write about and feature. And viral rumors about health are, among the most immediate and urgent examples of disinformation that we can tackle, because the impact is direct.
How have the Trump and Biden administrations affected the work that you all have been doing?
Oh, gosh. I think 2016, not so much the Trump administration, but the revelations about the role that the Russians played in 2016 and exactly what they were up to, which weren't entirely new, but the public just became aware of them, I think, more broadly around 2016. The Internet Research Agency in St. Petersburg, this operation with hundreds of paid trolls who are targeting the U.S. and other countries just to exacerbate divisions, and pose as Trump supporters, pose as progressives and liberals, and to sow rancor. They even organized protests and established Facebook groups, partisan Facebook groups, and their goal was just to drag Americans apart and to increase the amount of incivility in our national conversation. And as people became aware of that, I think more attention, we got a lot more attention from educators across the country who realized that they really need to be preparing students for this, from the public and from some funders. So 2016 was an inflection point. And then throughout the Trump presidency, the attacks on the press, the kind of constant stream of disinformation that people were dealing with was something that we had to speak to and address, even as a nonpartisan organization. And then, the 2020 election disinformation is something that we're still grappling with and dealing with the fallout from. We have a new 2022 election misinformation page on our site that we launched last week. We're going to be adding more resources there just to help people recognize some of the disinformation that experts are expecting to come back for the midterms that we saw in 2020. And then, the Biden administration has overseen, some ongoing situations that have thrown off misinformation as well. So a lot of these conversations are just continuing. Immigration misinformation, the situation at our border continues to generate mis and disinformation. So it's not that our work has stopped or even slowed down since Biden got into office. It's still a challenge.
So that lack of trust in authority and media are continuing to play into everything that you all are addressing.
Yeah, I mean, I think those trends were already happening, before the country was this polarized. I mean, we've been slowly polarizing for the last 15, 20 years. If you look at, public research data, Pew Research Center has some great data where they ask people the same questions year over year over year, and you can watch the median answer polarize on the left and right. Media distrust has been around for as long as there's been media. But I think it's more acute now. You've seen more physical attacks on the press. You saw physical threats against the press at protests across the country in the summer of 2020, Black Lives Matter protests and others. You've seen it in January 6th at political rallies. And so I think it's a deep concern. The press freedom ranking of the United States was never the top in the world. That's something that we work with students a lot. A lot of our students think that the U.S. is not only they think that the U.S. is the top when it comes to press freedoms, but they also think we're the only country in the world with a free press. And in fact, the U.S. in the global press freedom rankings by Reporters Without Borders usually rates in the 40s or 50s. And we've steadily slipped over the last several years, I think, in large part because of the political climate and because of these threats and animosity and hostility against the press.
What about people who aren't students, who aren't educators, who aren't even parents or grandparents and aren't going to come into contact with an education system and the News Literacy Project? How are you trying to reach them, or how are you reaching them?
Yeah, so that's a great question. In 2018, we sort of formally expanded our mission to include the public, so the non-educator, non-student public, and started to produce things to better serve them. One of those things was a mobile app that we called Informable that you can download in the App Store that sort of establishes some newsletter habits of mind and dispositions, just distinguishing between a fact-based statement and an opinion-based statement, for example, or distinguishing between straight news and opinion journalism, which is a key disposition. And then more infographics and quizzes on our website. We have a newsletter for the public called Get Smart About News that comes out once a week that gives people a concise summary of relevant headlines for news literacy reflection about everything from press freedoms and the First Amendment to social media content moderation to the practice of journalism to the loss of local news outlets, and then a digest of viral rumors that are circulating to help folks recognize that when it hits their feeds. And we are getting ready to launch a new platform on that front in the coming weeks. So in early October, we'll have a new misinformation viral rumor platform that the public can use to both learn about mis and disinformation and learn how to recognize it and to debunk it on their own, and to warn away their friends and family. So those are a few of the pieces. And then we also have public training, so webinars through AARP and other organizations to help reach the public. And we're expanding our team on that front as well. So I think a good way to stay up with that is to just follow the News Literacy Project on Twitter and social media. Check out our website because there's lots of exciting stuff happening there for the public. And we're at a really exciting point in this mission to build a movement to just sort of put facts back at the center of the national conversation and to help people avoid being exploited by falsehoods.
Peter, what are your closing thoughts?
I think, again, we're at a precarious moment where I think we've made a lot of issues in our national conversation partisan conversations that shouldn't be. I think the efficacy and safety of vaccines should not be a political conversation. The safety of genetically modified foods, the integrity of our elections, certainly. And I think we can't get swept up in the polarization so much that we forget that, and that we forget that, as journalists like to say, facts are stubborn things, but that we should pay attention to them. But I also think that we think about mis and disinformation and fact checking in the wrong way. I see this a lot on social media, where if someone debunks a viral rumor that resonates with your beliefs, right, that resonates with your positions, your values, that your response is to sort of push back against the fact check and defend the misinformation as though, debunking it somehow hurts your political position. I argue the opposite. I think mis and disinformation aims to exploit us, right? So, if you're on the left, misinformation wants to exploit your passionate desire for a more equitable society, for example. If you're on the right, maybe it attacks your patriotism and your religious faith, and uses that as a wedge to insert a false belief and get you to amplify that to your network, to your friends and family. And no one wants to be deceived, and no one is helped by having, false information inserted into their worldview. And so I think that would be my closing thought, just to recognize misinformation for what it is and the threat it poses, not just to our lives and to the lives of those we share it with, but to democracy at a really crucial point for our country.
Well, my closing thoughts include some of that. Building critical thinking skills has never been more urgent. And the News Literacy Project has been enhancing the understanding of journalism in a democracy, as well as helping students to build some life skills. But even more than that, it's also opening itself to everyone in the community. This is not just something for students and educators, it's for all of us. My guest on this edition of Chicago Media Talks, recorded via Zoom and broadcast on YouTube September 19, 2022, has been Peter Adams, Senior Vice President of Research and Design for the News Literacy Project. You can reach him on Twitter at PeterD_Adams, and you can reach me at Sheila@Rivet360.com. For producers Jesse Patin and Janine Harston, and everyone at Rivet 360, thanks for listening to Chicago Media Talks.